The first Bible reading today is from Proverbs 22, verses 1 to 2, 8 to 9, and 22 to 23. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. The rich and the poor have this in common: the Lord is the maker of them all. Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of anger will fail. Those who are generous are blessed, for they share their bread with the poor. Do not rob the poor because they are poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. For the Lord pleads their cause and despoils of life those who despoil them. Today's gospel reading is from Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 37. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then she returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak."
We cannot help but admire that woman's strength. We cannot help but admire that woman's determination, that woman's courage. After all, she pushed back against Jesus in a way no one else had up to that point, and in a way no one else ever would again. At the end of the day, she bested Jesus at his own game, and the reward for such was life for her daughter. Now, we're not told what her name is, which goes to show just how little respect society had for her, because in most cases within Scripture, when it's a man who comes to Jesus in need of something, when it's a man who comes to Jesus in need of healing, we know his name. Zacchaeus, Bartimaeus, Jairus. But let a woman show great faith and moxie. All we know about her was that she wasn't Jewish. She was Phoenician. For the sake of argument, we can call her Amina, and we can call her daughter Rasha, because those are two of the most popular names for women in Syria. And I happen to think that both she and her daughter deserve to be named especially considering the risk that was taken. Let's face it, if this had been 21st century and not first century, the chances are very, very good that Amina would have been gassed by her own government, or like hundreds of the other women in Syria just in the last year, been a victim of an honor killing for having brought shame to her family and negatively impacting her family's reputation in the broader community. Rasha would have been an orphan, most likely a refugee, risking her own life, seeking asylum in another country, probably being denied and then ostracized out of concerns because of her country of origin. But still, there she is. There Amina is, entering into this stranger's home because she had heard about this man named Jesus. His reputation had preceded him. Amina bowed down at his feet as a sign of reverence and respect. She dared speak, but she had to. She had to because her beloved daughter Rasha was sick. An unclean spirit was the official diagnosis. And if not healed, Rasha faced death at worst, and at best a life being shunned and excluded from the community she had known. Amina did not ask of Jesus. She begged. She begged as any mother would do on behalf of her child. So often in these circumstances, we hear that Jesus took pity, that Jesus showed compassion, that Jesus was deeply grieved, but not this time. No, this time Jesus seemed angry. Jesus seemed bothered. He had been trying to get away. He didn't want anybody to follow him. He didn't want anybody to know where he was, but yet they still did. He was bothered. And rather than push back against an oppressive custom and tradition that excluded or separated as he regularly did, Jesus embraced those divisions. Jesus embraced the oppressive customs and traditions. He gave them power. He gave them legitimacy. A few weeks ago in Bible study, I asked the question, of all of Jesus' teachings, which one for you is the hardest to embrace? Which one is the hardest to understand? Which one is the hardest to get? And this text, Clarissa, this text was one of the ones that was lifted up before the community. We don't like this text. We want to dismiss this text. At least we want to dismiss Jesus' behaviors within the text. But there is no getting around the fact that Jesus calls this woman and her child dogs. Now, it's not the first time that Jesus has resorted to name calling, but usually it's the scribes and the Pharisees who are on the receiving end of Jesus' anger and frustration. But this time we have a faithful and determined woman and her ill child. No bread for you, Jesus proclaims. No bread for you. The bread is for the children, and it's not to be thrown to the dogs like you. When I saw that this was the text for this week, out of my own dislike for it, out of my own discomfort for it, and probably because of my own wish that if I didn't see it, if I didn't act like that text is there, then I don't have to acknowledge that it exists. My first thought was, well, let's see what the Old Testament has to say for us this week. I'm sure the Old Testament lectionary text is far less complicated than this text of Jesus calling this woman a dog. So I turned to the Old Testament, Proverbs 22. A group of sayings just strung together. 3 sections, 2 verses each of sayings strung together without any real context. As Will Willimon says, they're the kinds of things you would hear if you were stuck on a long road trip with your mother in the back seat. and not wanting to broach the subject of Jesus' denial of healing and denigration of one who came before him, I read these words. Those who are generous are blessed, for they share their bread with the poor. And I thought, well played, lectionary, well played. Because you can't preach a text that says, those who are generous are blessed, for they share their bread with the poor, when you refuse to preach and acknowledge a text where Jesus essentially denies the bread of life, to use the image that John had used, to a woman and daughter who come from other sides of societal boundaries. Well, I guess you can preach that text while ignoring the other, but if you do, you look kind of stupid doing it. And not to be lost among all the controversy surrounding Jesus' interactions regarding Amina and Rasha is the fact that this is a healing story. Like so many others like it, a person comes to Jesus seeking healing for themselves or on behalf of a loved one. And in the end, it's the faithfulness of the person asking or the faithfulness of the sick person that brings about the desired healing. But we cannot ignore all of the boundaries that are overcome. They cannot simply be dismissed. And we cannot say, well, because Rasha was healed, none of that other stuff matters. Because it does matter. It matters a lot. It matters a whole bunch. Especially as we, as God's people, as followers, as disciples of the one named Jesus, seek to also be faithful in our relationships with those who come to us, seeking healing, seeking justice. We can't serve the community and provide them with ministry and healing and say that because we do that, then it's okay to also shame and denigrate that same community. We have to acknowledge Amina and Rasha's poverty. We have to acknowledge Amina and Rasha's social status. We have to acknowledge Amina and Rasha's identity. We also have to acknowledge that within this text, we have to acknowledge Jesus' blatant sexism and bigotry. We have to acknowledge. We have to call out the injustice. We have to call out the violence inherent in the system. Amina just wants her daughter to be healed. And yet there are so many boundaries standing in the way of that healing. Also, by the way, as you heard, Proverbs says this. The rich and the poor, they have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. The rich and the poor have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. West Florissant, New Florissant, the Lord is the maker of them all. North County, West County, the Lord is the maker of them all. North City and Ladue, the Lord is the maker of them all. Ferguson, Creve Coeur, Delwood, Clayton, the Lord is the maker of us all. Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of anger will fail. Do not rob the poor because they are poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. Whether a woman and daughter from Syria, a Palestinian Jew from Nazareth, or a teacher or engineer from the heartland of America, the Lord is the maker of us all. And we would do well to remember that in how we look at, how we interact with, and how we treat one another. we cannot help but admire that woman's strength. We cannot help but admire that woman's determination. We cannot help but admire Amina's courage. After all, she pushed back against Jesus in a way no one else had up until that point. She pushed back against Jesus in a way that no one else would after that. And at the end of the day, she bested Jesus at his own game, and the reward for such was life for her daughter. But in the process of that healing, there is great discomfort, if not anger, in the midst of it all. Is our discomfort with this text found because of the name calling? Is our discomfort with the text because, as one pastor put it, it highlights a reality that is named by Jesus, that in this world of haves and have-nots, there are some who benefit and receive, while there are others who have to wait in line. Is it both of these? Is it one of these, the other? Is it both? Is there discomfort? Is there anger in knowing that Mark places this account of Jesus pushing a woman away and referring to her as a dog? Is there discomfort in knowing that Mark places this in between a story where Jesus tells people that it is what comes out of a person's mouth that defiles them, and then a story of him feeding 4,000 people? Jesus literally calls a mother and her sick daughter dogs right after he has told people that what comes out of your mouth comes from your heart, and that's what makes you unclean in the eyes of God. And then he denies bread, if you will, right before he provides bread to the masses. Does that make you uncomfortable? Or is the discomfort found? Is the discomfort found that within all of our pious actions as God-loving Jesus followers, that within all of our pious actions, within all of our prayers, and within all of our church attendance, and within all of our mission and justice ministries reaching out to and alongside the community, that within all of our attempts as God's people to be faithful in our need and in our hope to see Jesus reflected in ourselves, in our need, in our hope to see Jesus reflected in ourselves, that our discomfort is because within this text we see ourselves reflected in the actions and in the behaviors of Jesus. Maybe that's the problem. This is actually one of those cases where we have no problem seeing ourselves in the actions of Jesus. And that's just too much for us to bear.